Hey there, Hungry Monk students and fans. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple different ways of playing scales, different patterns you can use when you're playing scales on the mandolin or any instrument really. Rather than maybe just starting at the beginning of a scale and working your way up the scale, we're going to talk about some patterns that can get you up and back, up and down the scale in a slightly more interesting way. You'll also find that these little patterns show up in actual tunes, fiddle tunes, and other melodies quite often. And if you can just whip them off, that makes it that much easier to get through those tunes and to memorize how to play those tunes. So we'll look at a couple different keys. Here we go. All right, the first pattern we're going to look at, we're going to use a D major scale. Pretty easy scale to play. You start on your open D string, the third string, and you should know your scale pattern. One octave up and back. So rather than just playing scales over and over again like that, one note after another, it's nice to sometimes come up with some patterns, sequences that you can use. One kind of sequence, a really good way to go, is basically to play in thirds. In other words, you're going to play the first three notes of the scale. 1, 2, 3. That's a third from that first note of the scale to the third note of the scale. And then you go back to the first note again. So it's a 4-note pattern. 1, 2, 3, 4. So you started on D and you ended on D. Up 3 notes, back to the note you started with. Now the next note of the scale, the second note of the scale, is your first finger on the second fret, that's E. And we're going to do the same thing. Play 3 notes up and back to the first note, E, we started on. Next note of the scale, F sharp, 3 notes, 1, 2, 3. Now you got to go to the next string, open, right? F sharp, G, A, back to the F sharp. Next note of the scale is G, up 3 notes, back to G. Next note is A. Next note is B, 1, 2, 3, back to B. And then we're going to do one more. Next note of the scale is C sharp, actually. Now we go one note above the key, the D. C sharp, D. D is the end of the scale, but we want to go 3 notes. So we go up to E, back to C sharp, and we end on D. Now there's any number of ways to think about doing this. You can think about 1, 2, 3, and back to the original note. And then go up to the next note. What you'll notice is I'm very slowly creeping up the scale. I'm starting with D, D, to E, to F sharp, to G, to A, B, C, and finally D. So if I take the first note of each of those little 4-note patterns, I'm working my way up the D major scale. You can do that very slowly. Make sure you've got a hold of that pattern. Eventually, now once you're here in D, now what you want to do is be able to go backwards and do the same thing. So now you're starting on D. You go 3 notes, 1, 2, 3, and back to the note you started with, which is D. Down to the next note of the scale, C sharp, 1, 2, 3, back to C sharp, B, A, back to A, G, back to G, F sharp, back to F sharp, Here's another one. E, D. We reach down for the C sharp. Back to E and finish on D. So the descending pattern. So that's a nice little pattern to do. You will find this little pattern in various tunes. One that comes to mind is the B section of Arkansas Traveler, which usually goes. So there's just little bits of that. It starts up on this A. So it does 3 of them in a row. It's handy to know this pattern because those 3, that can either be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 notes, or it can be a simple pattern that your brain and your fingers just say, oh, that pattern, sure, there it is. Those little patterns happen quite often, and even if they don't happen in a tune, it's a great little finger exercise. It's also a really good way to make sure you know your scale. One of the problems with scales is the pattern is so simple that your fingers can learn it fairly quickly and your brain stops working and maybe you're not quite sure what you're doing. But this really makes sure that you know your way up and back through that scale. Now, I just went from D to D, an octave scale. But if you can hear this pattern, you should be able to go as far as you want with the scale. We did this, and we ended here, but I could go up even another octave. Once you can start to hear that scale, you'll be able to hear how it goes. Now, I did make sure that I was playing all the notes in the key of D major. It helps, obviously, to know the D major scale. That's D to D, but you probably want to know where it goes even beyond that. You can easily go up to the A, and you can easily go down to the A. So we could go from D and further. And back. That's as far as we can go. You can maybe hear what the next pitch is supposed to be, but it's just not there. So that's a great little scale pattern. It's basically using thirds. You are going 1, 2, 3. You're traveling a third and then back to the note. We could do the same thing in the key of G. Start on your low G scale. Now it's quite easy to do yet another octave. I'm on the octave G. And then backwards. Whoops, I made a mistake. G. So, nice little scale pattern. You can do it on any of the open strings. A. If you are doing, that's using open strings. If you're using a closed position scale, let's say G. Closed positions, you can do the same thing. 1, 2, 3, back to the beginning. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. So you should be able to do that with closed position scales as well. That way when you're in B flat, when the guitar player in your bluegrass band puts a capo on the 3rd fret and plays out of G and says, oh, we're now in B flat, and you're a mandolin player, so you're not allowed to use a capo. So you actually have to play in B flat. Sorry. So you could do that. Once you learn that pattern, you can do it anywhere. E flat. Scales in thirds and sequences and patterns. There's a million different ones that you can do. That is a pretty good one, so we'll just leave it at that. Get out there and practice. See you next time.